For a long time, the world thought it had Filipinos figured out. Quiet, too friendly, too poor to matter. A country good for beaches, cheap labor, nothing more. The Philippines was often seen as a place people left, not a place people looked up to. When foreigners talked about Filipinos, it was usually about nurses, caregivers, or domestic workers. Hardworking, yes, but rarely powerful, rarely influential. And the country itself, many outsiders saw it as weak, corrupt, and forever behind its neighbors. But how did this image form? And more importantly, why did so many people believe it without ever questioning it? To understand the misunderstanding, we need to go back in history, far back. The Philippines was colonized for more than 300 years, first by Spain, then by the United States, and later occupied by Japan during World War II. Few nations in the world experienced layered colonization like this. Each empire did not just take land, it shaped education, language, culture, and even how Filipinos were presented to the world. Under Spain, Filipinos were portrayed as subjects, religious, obedient, and rural. Spanish historians rarely highlighted Filipino resistance, yet rebellions were constant, from Lapu-Lapu in Magellan in 1521 to the Gahoy's revolt that lasted 85 years, one of the longest rebellions in colonial history. Still, these stories barely made it into Western history books. Then came the Americans. They introduced public education, democracy, and English. On the surface, this looked like progress, but it also created a new image Filipinos as students, not equals. The US openly described Filipinos as little brow brothers who needed guidance. That phrase alone quietly shaped global perception for generations. During this period, Filipinos were taught to admire Western systems, Western heroes, Western success. So when the world saw Filipinos speaking fluent English, smiling, adapting easily, they assumed imitation, not intelligence. But was it imitation or mastery? World War II added another layer. The Philippines was devastated. Manila became one of the most destroyed cities of the war, second only to Warsaw. Filipino guerrillas fought alongside Allied forces, gathering intelligence, sabotaging Japanese supply lines, and protecting civilians. Yet after the war, global narratives focused on American victories, while Filipino resistance was reduced to a footnote. Unlike Japan or China, the Philippines did not project power early. It didn't build empires or flex military strength abroad. Unlike South Korea or Singapore, it did not industrialize fast enough to create a miracle story the world could easily admire. Progress was uneven, messy, and constantly interrupted by war, politics, and foreign influence. And so perception hardened. Because Filipinos smiled easily, they were seen as emotionally soft. Because they were polite, they were seen as submissive. Because they avoided confrontation, they were labeled weak. Yet history tells a different story. Filipinos did not lack discipline. They survived centuries of control. They didn't lack strategy. They mastered adaptation. They were not passive. They were patient. Revolutions do not always look loud. Strength doesn't always shout. Over time, stereotypes piled up. Talented but never dominant. Smart but never strategic. Kind but not formidable. But ask yourself, how does a nation survive conquest after conquest and keep its identity? How does a people absorb foreign cultures yet remain unmistakably themselves? Was the world really seeing the truth? Or was it mistaking restraint for weakness and humility for lack of power? Here is what many people missed. Filipinos did not survive centuries of colonization by being weak. They survived by being adaptable, resilient, and strategic. Skills harden not in comfort, but under pressure. When power is taken away, Filipinos learn how to move quietly, how to wait, how to endure without losing themselves. Revolutions did not disappear, they went underground. They went underground. And when open rebellion meant execution, resistance became coded. It lived in folk songs, poems, and stories passed from one generation to the next. It lived in the Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society that organized in silence until the moment was right. When the Philippine Revolution finally erupted in 1896, it shocked Spain, not because Filipinos were angry, but because they had been patiently preparing. Even after Spain fell, Filipinos faced a new colonizer. During American rule, resistance did not always look like war. It looked like education. Filipinos became teachers, lawyers, doctors, and writers. They learned the system so well that they could eventually run it themselves. Leaders like Manuel Quezon, Sergio Osmeña, and Clark M. Recto negotiated, debated, and outmaneuvered colonial authority using its own language and laws. This was not passivity, it was long term thinking. World War II tested this quiet strength. Again, when Japan occupied the Philippines, Filipinos formed one of the largest guerrillas in Asia. Farmers, students, and ordinary citizens turned into intelligence networks. They hid radios, mapped enemy positions, and protected Allied soldiers. Many paid with their lives. Few demanded recognition. After the war, the country was in ruins. Manila lay flattened. The economy shattered. And yet, in 1946, the Philippines emerged as one of the first independent nations in Asia. Still, the world was not impressed. Why? Because Filipinos did not announce their suffering or broadcast their endurance, they simply rebuilt. Families sent members overseas, not to escape the country, but to support those who stayed behind. Remittances became lifelines. Homes were built by brick. Education continued when resources were scarce. Filipinos endured military rule, political instability, typhoons, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, some of the strongest natural disasters on Earth. Each time the response looked the same: clean up, move forward, help one another, and keep going. No grand speeches, no global pity campaigns, just survival. And sometimes the nations that last the longest are the ones that learn how to wait for decades. The pattern stayed the same. Filipinos left home and quietly proved themselves elsewhere, in hospitals across the Middle East, Europe, and North America. Filipino doctors and nurses became known not just for skill, but for endurance, taking the hardest shifts, adapting to new systems, and earning trust fast. On ships, crossing every ocean, Filipino seafarers became the backbone of the global trade, so essential that at one point a large percentage of the world's merchant fleet depended on them. In classroom from Asia to Africa, Filipino teachers were praised for clarity, patience, and discipline. In engineering firms and tech companies, Filipino professionals blended technical ability with problem solving under pressure. Employers noticed something unusual. Filipinos did not just follow instructions, they adjusted, improved, and held teams together. Yet these successes were treated as individual stories, not a national pattern. Militarily, the same thing happened. Foreign armies trained alongside Filipino soldiers and special forces. Exercises revealed jungle warfare skills, stamina, and mental toughness, built from terrain and experience. Why? Because Filipinos rarely marketed their strength. Privately, foreign officers spoke with respect. Publicly, the stereotype remained unchanged. Why? Because Filipinos rarely marketed their strength. They didn't frame themselves as elite. They didn't boast. They simply performed. Sports told a similar story. Filipino athletes entered global competitions as underdogs, often dismissed because of size, funding, or background. Then they surprised everyone. From boxing to weightlifting to basketball on the world stage, moments of dominance appeared. At each time, and each time the reaction was the same. Where did this come from? As if it hadn't always been there. Even in crisis zone and peacekeeping missions, Filipino contingents earned reputations for discipline and composure. They negotiated when others escalated. They held ground when others withdrew. But headlines rarely lingered. So the image persisted. Capable, yes, but not formidable. Reliable, but not threatening. Useful, but not influential. Until something shifted. Not gradually, not in academic journals or quiet reports, but in moments the world could see. Moments caught on camera. Moments that spread online. Moments that forced people to pause and rethink everything they thought they knew. And when that shift came, it didn't ask for permission, it demanded attention. Because underestimation only works until reality shows up all at once. The moment did not come from one single event, it came from many moments colliding at once. The world watched Manny Pacquiao, a man from extreme poverty, dismantling boxing legends and dominating multiple weight classes. Not just winning, but overwhelming opponents who underestimated him. Then came global crisis. Filipino nurses and doctors stood at the front line during the pandemic, saving lives across the world. Countries realized they were not just workers, they were backbones. In geopolitics, analysts started noticing something strange. The Philippines, long assumed weak, was suddenly central to regional power dynamics. Foreign militaries began strengthening alliances. Global leaders started paying attention. Defense experts openly admitted something they once ignored. Filipinos are not easy to intimidate. And online, something else happened. Filipino creators, speakers, analysts, and thinkers began dominating global conversations confidently and fluently. That was the moment. The moment the world realized in dealing with a passive people, but with a nation that had been holding back. The shock wasn't about strength alone, it was about contrast. How could a country labeled poor produce world class talent everywhere? How could a people seen as submissive stand so firm under pressure? How could a nation ignored for decades suddenly matter so much? The answer was simple but uncomfortable. The world had confused humility with inferiority. They mistook patience for weakness. They underestimated a culture. They underestimated a culture built on endurance. Filipinos did not need validation, but once attention arrived, they were ready. Today, the narrative is changing. Filipinos are no longer just participants, they are leaders, not just helpers, but decision makers, not just survivors, but influencers of global direction. And perhaps the biggest realization of all is this: the Philippines was never weak, it was simply misunderstood. So the real question now is not whether the world was wrong about Filipinos. The real question is, what else has the world been wrong about simply because it did not look closely enough?